All right, everybody. Welcome to Chapter 6. Today we're talking about what happens after you have done a vulnerability scan. And for those of you watching the corner of the screen carefully, you'll notice that it looks like my cat has decided to join us for this discussion of cybersecurity. So we'll see how that goes. So in the last couple chapters, we've been talking about what we would do if we were trying to scan sorry about this. We were trying to scan systems for vulnerabilities. Chapter 4 was how we would do those scans, and then Chapter 5 was how we would understand the results of those scans, right? And so what we're going to try to do now is we're going to try to take a look at sort of matching those vulnerabilities with a particular sort of what's termed as an exploit. So an exploit is kind of how we're going to actually take advantage of those vulnerabilities to give us access to the system. And so there's sort of a couple steps here. After we're able to get access to the system, we're doing what the book refers to as a pivot. Now, if you're trying to look at sort of the exploit and pivot and that sort of stuff, this does not sort of match up to the outline in Chapter 1 with the same sort of consistency of terms that we would hope it would have. So you can probably figure out generally where this is with sort of on that timeline, but it's not. If you go look back at the kill chain model, for example, for something that says exploit and pivot, I don't think you're going to find it. So, but what this is referring to is the exploit is sort of the initial access to the system, and then a pivot here is if you are trying to use that system that you've gotten access to take a look at sort of other potential systems that you could also run exploits on. So if you were able to get access to a system, and it's the first system on a network that you've been able to sort of to breach, then you're going to be able to see a bunch of other systems from that system that you weren't able to see earlier. And so that's when the book talks about a pivot, that's what it's that it's referring to. And then as sort of at the end of the chapter, we talk about the general techniques that you could use to try to make sure that you still have access to the system that you've exploited. So if you get initial access to something and then say somebody runs an antivirus scan or they have alerts set up when new accounts are created, how is that something that you would be able to try to get past? And that's what we'll talk about in the end. But for this first video, we're going to talk about exploits, and then we're going to demonstrate some stuff with Metasploit here. So let's, despite all the cat hair now in the immediate vicinity, let's go ahead and keep moving on. So if you're following along in the book, we are now on page 184. So anytime you have a sort of a list of vulnerabilities, you're going to have vulnerabilities that are categorized as sort of large vulnerabilities or sort of things that are just informational sort of things that don't really have too much potential for actually breaking into a system. As a general rule, though, and this is kind of to sum up what we talked about last time, the vulnerabilities that you're gonna look at are gonna tell you basically how large a problem it is. Now, remember that those vulnerability scanners are working from the point of view of somebody who's trying to secure the system, and as penetration testers, we're trying to access the system. So a vulnerability that's ranked as a higher vulnerability is going to be something that for us is going to be easier to exploit. So remember, some of the ways of thinking about that are going to be a little bit backwards. So this is sort of the example ratings that you would expect to see for vulnerabilities. And so you would take those the vulnerabilities that you see in a report like this and compare those to the exploits. So this is another. So this is a list of vulnerabilities, and this is what you would expect to see if you actually clicked on one of them and and sort of read more about a particular vulnerability. So the thing that I think is probably important to know, though, is those vulnerabilities are not necessarily going to directly map to any exploit that you have. So if you have some sort of potential vulnerability, think about a vulnerability as a potential way to access the system. And if somebody has written down an exploit, this is the way you're actually going to use that vulnerability to get in. And there's a couple of these online that are sort of databases that have sort of various features in them, and we're on page 188. Is that right? Yeah, we're on page 188. If you want to go read a little bit more about those, there's a homework question where you get to match each one of these to the description of what it does. But any one of these, if you're able to find an exploit for the vulnerability that you find, you're going to be able to see how you're going to be able to actually use that vulnerability to access the system. Now, any one of these sort of exploits that's out there is out there because somebody actually tried to figure out how to use it, and that's referred to as sort of exploit development. And this is the part of hacking where somebody that does this is going to be sort of either a professional hacker or somebody who's a sort of state-sponsored person. This is not something that's typically done by script kiddies. If after the exploit is sort of out in the out in the world, it's in one of those databases. It may be easier for people to actually use, and we'll talk about how we can do that in just a bit. But actually developing one of these things may take code development and a whole bunch of trial and error. Now, in the process of that exploit being developed, you can have what's called a proof of concept, and this is a proof of concept is kind of a general thing that's referred to both in software and any sort of manufacturing where you're doing prototyping is another way to sort of a similar concept. But if you can come up with a way in which you can see that exploit would actually work. Again, what we're talking about here, and the a proof of concept would be to prove that there's a flaw, and that's not a flaw in the exploit software that somebody's running, but that's a flaw in the actual system that you're trying to demonstrate that it contains a vulnerability. But it's not necessarily something that's going to be useful for people that are hacking into systems in the real world. For example, you may have a mail server that's configured in a particular way, and you have to configure it in a particular way in order for the exploit to work. So if you had something like that, you wouldn't expect it to run on any other mail server, only the ones that are configured exactly like yours. That's sort of what this first bullet point is talking about here. So anytime you have an exploit out there, you may have to modify how it works in order to get it to work for the system that you're trying to exploit. I think for most of us, we're probably aware that different versions of software act in different ways. And so if you are trying to run an exploit on a version of Windows that has a service pack on it, and it was developed for that same version of Windows that didn't have a service pack, we wouldn't necessarily have the expectation that they work in exactly the same way. There's also this concept of exploit chaining, where you take the first exploit and you are able to get information about that. Let's say that you find some bug in an email software that doesn't necessarily give you access to the system, but it gives you a lot of detailed information about how the system is set up. If that information that you're able to get there helps you to access the system using a different exploit, then what you're doing is exploit chaining there. So you're using one exploit to give you information that can help you use another exploit. So that's what that concept is. Now the thing here I think we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about is something called Metasploit. Now, Metasploit is built into Kali, and I imagine that some of you that messed around with Kali last semester probably have probably at least launched this. Hang on just a second. Sorry about that. I had to sneeze, and I didn't figure that you guys wanted to have your ears blown out if I did that into the microphone. So, anyway, Metasploit. Metasploit is it comes in a couple different versions. There is a version that comes with Kali. It's built in. That's the open source version. There's also a version that you can pay for. Um, and the next couple slides actually show you how to do stuff in Metasploit. So rather than actually just clicking through a whole bunch of slides, let me go ahead and see if we can bring up a copy of Kali. And I'm going to move my face over to the top right because that means it's going to be out of the way for what we're doing here. And so let's go ahead and log in. And if I can remember my password, this will go better. So there's a couple different ways you can launch Metasploit. The easiest thing to do is going to be to come up to the thing here and type Meta, and it's going to go ahead and find it for you. And when it tries to launch, what it's going to do is it's going to try to run the sort of the initial database setup, and then it's going to go ahead and launch Metasploit. Now, this is something that it does every time, but it doesn't really need to. After that's been done once on the system, we don't really need to worry about it. I'm going to make this a little bigger and make it easier for you guys to see here. And now we're at something that looks like a command prompt. So if you want to launch that from the command line, all you have to do is type msf console like this. And it's going to go ahead and launch. It should launch a little faster because it's not trying to initialize the database, which is already in existence. So I know that at least some of you in this class are excited about the Goose in general. For those of you that like the Goose, there's well, here he is. Metasploit is actually going to launch a different banner every time that it launches. Just some of these are kind of whimsical and fun. If you type banner, you can actually take a look at what some of the banners are here that show up. There's all sorts of fun sort of references that it has in here, and whenever you launch Metasploit, it launches it just runs one of these banner commands. The only example that your book has is the cow say one. It's a little ASCII cow, but there's all sorts of stuff, and you can see that people here that have written these things have the same sort of demented humor that you would sort of expect them to. Anyway, Metasploit is something that runs off of a command line interface, but it has its own set of commands. So if you're in here and you're trying to do things that are the Linux commands that you've used here, they may or may not work, or they may work in a different sort of way than you would expect them to. But probably the first thing that we should do when we launch Metasploit, if we don't know what we're doing, is type help. And we might want to type banner a couple times to see if we can get the Goose to come up. But if we're actually trying to get something done, if we type help, it gives us sort of a whole bunch of information here about commands that we can use. So there is a link underneath your chapter resources that explain a lot of what these things do in much greater detail than what you're going to see here. So I'd encourage you guys to take a look at that if you are interested in using Metasploit. If you don't have access to a Kali VM here, this is something just to follow along with. You don't necessarily, there's not going to be any in-class work that requires you to have access to Kali or to Metasploit. But if this is something that you've got, you can follow along and type in some of these commands too. So the first thing that we can do here is if I type show exploits, Metasploit here is going to take a minute or so to list pretty much all of the exploits that it has in sort of built into its database that it's prepared to run. Now, one of the things that's interesting here is if you compare the number of exploits that's in here to the number of exploits that's in any one of those online databases that we saw earlier, the number of exploits that you're going to see in Metasploit is much smaller. So if if you have the ones that you see online are basically sort of lists of all the possible exploits that you could do, and the ones that are in Metasploit are only the ones that have sort of been built in, and that somebody has written code to actually help you try to do. So I think there's a homework question that makes reference to which one of these is going to be a larger database. Metasploit is going to be generally a smaller database than anything that you're going to see online, because anything that's in here has sort of already had code for it to be written. If that makes sense. So what what we're going to see here is that if we scroll through all of these, we have a list of an enormous list, basically, of all these sort of potential exploits that we could run. Now, we can search for particular exploits if we want to. And what I'm going to do here is, excuse me, there's a search command that has a couple different options. And the example that your book gives is that if we say search -R and then we search for say great here, there's a rating of each one of these things, and if we do that, then it should give us really only sort of results that are rated as great. And you can see here that this didn't really work quite as we expected to. There's some here that are normal, there's some that are good, some that are average, and only one here that is great. So if you go look in help, the -R sort of option isn't mentioned at all. So I think that what the book is using is a slightly older version of Metasploit than what we have here. You can get the same sort of result that that command is supposed to do by doing search rank great. And if you do something like that, then that's going to work a lot better. There's a couple things here. There's the ranking for each one of these things, and there's a table on 194 that explains what each of these mean. But they pretty much start with excellent and then go down to great, good, normal, average, low, and manual. Excellent is obviously the best one. Remember, this is written from the perspective of a penetration tester, and each one of these words mean sort of something that is something specific. So if you have one that's great, for example, that means that there's a default target that exploit has, probably that's related to a particular version of the software. And if you use a great exploit here, it's going to be smart enough to sort of auto detect the version of the software that it has. It's going to do a version check and figure out exactly what's going on for you. Something that's good, it means that there's a default target, and that's sort of the thing that's common. If you have something that's excellent, what that means is that if you run that exploit, no matter what happens, it's not going to crash the software service. Now that if you're thinking, well, what if I'm trying to crash something? Well, keep in mind, if you're running an exploit to try to get access to the system, if you're trying to do this, say, over FTP, and you crash FTP, well, you're probably not going to be able to use FTP to log into the system because it's not working anymore. So that's what those rating systems mean. There's something else here with this yes/no column here that let's see, what's the term that it uses for that? And that's the check column. And what the check column is a way of sort of testing the exploit before you can run it. If you've got something that says yes, you can actually sort of give this thing a trial run before you do it. If it says no, then there's not really a way to do that. You just got to go for it. So what you're going to do here, and the general sort of idea is that you would try to look for an exploit that corresponds to a vulnerability that you've already found. So stepping through the vulnerability scanner to something like this is going to be a little bit more involved, and I don't really have a system on the network that has a lot of vulnerabilities that I can try to exploit. So some of this is going to be this is how it would work, but you would actually want to do this to a real system. So the way you would actually pick an exploit to run is you can say use, and then you can give it sort of an exploit name, and the same sort of tab complete that you're used to here in Linux is gonna still be there. So this is one of those exploits up here. So you would just, if you wanted to run this one, say you could copy that text in and just put it after the word use. So use tells us that we're going to go ahead and use that particular exploit. And you can tell this is the one we're using because it puts it in the command line. Now, if you want to see sort of what you could do at this point, you're going to go ahead and type options, and it's going to give you sort of a whole list of things that you could do here. So one of the things that we've got to do is that we have to set the IP address of the target. Right now, I don't have a Windows 2000 server on this network, so I'm just going to go ahead and say set our hosts, and then I'm going to set that to my my loopback address. Now, just so you guys know, this is not going to work. I'm not going to be able to run this exploit on my Kali system because this is the target is something else. All right. I just wanted to show you guys what this looks like when it runs, and then after I set that, I can type run. And when I type run, it's going to actually try to run that using the information that I already have set in there. Now, this isn't going to work, so this is what it looks like when it doesn't work. The book has an example of what it looks like when it does. But that's how you would actually run an exploit in Metasploit. So I'm going to go ahead and type exit, and that gets me back to my command line. So that's kind of a really brief, down and dirty introduction to how you would actually use Metasploit. The one thing that's left in this section of the chapter is talking about something called Powersploit. Powersploit is sort of the equivalent, well, not necessarily the equivalent, but it's written in Windows PowerShell, and it's designed to provide some of the same sort of capabilities that Metasploit does. And even though it's written in PowerShell, it's also installed by default on Kali. And if you want to run it, you can type Powersploit, and there you go. We're now running Powersploit. We're not really going to get too much into that one, but if that's something that you want to take a look at, be aware that that's there. So when we come back, we will talk about some of the more specific exploits that exist out there.